Thank you all so very much for joining us for this LGBT History Month event. We're very lucky that the University of Wolverhampton have supported us in putting this on, and thank you so much to Elena and the events team for supporting us today, and thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm going to introduce our panel. We're looking at today writing LGBT characters, writing queer characters, queer representation, all those sort of things. Please feel free to put any questions that you might want the panel to answer in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can today. My name's James Lovelock. I'm a lecturer in musical theatre at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'm currently writing a book on LGBTQ characters and queer representation in musical theatre, which is how I've met these lovely people that are going to be on your panel this afternoon. So if I get everyone to introduce themselves, I'm just going to do it in the order I can see you. So can I get Tania, can I get you to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Tania Azevedo. I am a theatre director and creator of new musical theatre. I am originally from Portugal. I am London-based. I collaborate quite a lot with Finn Anderson, who is here, which is great. So we can talk a little bit about our collaboration. I mostly develop new musical theatre, both as a dramaturg and a director. And yeah, I think that's enough for me. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thanks, Tania. Thank you so much. Finn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, yeah, I'm Finn Anderson, coming to you from Glasgow in Scotland, and I am a composer, songwriter, and writer, depending on the project. But yeah, so I make musical theatre, and depending on who the collaborators are, what the process is, sometimes I write script, music, and lyrics. Sometimes just one element of those, and also work a lot with Tania, as Tania mentioned. And yeah, great to be here today, and I use he, him pronouns.
Thanks so much, Finn. And Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Laura Schein. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California. I am raised in Chicago, and I have actually spent before our pandemic started, I was in New York doing my original musical Emoji Land, which premiered off-Broadway in January 2020. And so I've been working on Emoji Land. That was sort of my big debut as a musical theater writer. But I've been working on a lot of projects other than that as well that have not premiered yet. But I mainly write lyrics, but also I'm a composer as well, and librettist, and she, her.
Thanks so much, Laura. Thank you. It's so lovely to have these people with us. I have been really lucky that I have experienced their work, sometimes as an audience member, but also at the University of Wolverhampton. I know that we've worked with Finn's music, and I know that we've worked with some of Tania's work as well. I know, and Laura may not know this, but we have certainly mentioned Emoji Land several times when we've been talking about musical theatre and talking about representation in musical theatre. And I suppose what I wanted to start off thinking about today was the idea of representation and representing different parts of the LGBTQ community in the work that we write. And I was wondering whether you might be able to talk a little bit about some of the characters that you've created and how you've gone about. I mean, it may be no different to writing any other characters, but how you've gone about writing those characters and how that kind of representation works. Is there anyone that would like to kind of start off by talking about that at all? This is the awkward moment where everyone goes, no, we don't want to talk about that. Is there anyone that would be happy to talk about that at all?
Oh, I'll start. Well, so, I do think, when writing Emojiland, our source material was emojis. So, there were endless narrative options when looking at emojis, and endless character options. And so, when we first started writing it in 2014, when emojis just came onto our phones, yeah, we started writing Emojiland way before the Emoji movie was ever announced, if anyone knows what that is, but nothing to do with it. And yeah, so there have been many versions of Emojiland and many characters that have gone in and out of versions of it during the 6 years that we wrote and rewrote and rewrote and rewrote it. But when we first started writing, it was the emojis 1.0 that were on our phone. So those were the emojis that we had to choose from. We didn't have Nerd Face yet, who came in a later update, who ended up being the protagonist, actually. But construction worker and police officer. So we use, for all the characters in Emojiland, we use the actual like Unicode names. So like, you know, woman with bunny ears, or, you know, like, and there are a lot of characters that are gendered in that way. When we first started writing it, there was like man in business suit levitating is an emoji, and he's in the show. And since we've been writing, since we premiered in January, that character has actually in the Unicode library is now person in business suit levitating. So emojis have evolved and sort of gotten with the picture since we started writing also, which is really cool. And also with all the different skin tones that they've put with all the emojis. So it's been interesting to see the evolution. But construction worker and police officer were two emojis in the OG 1.0 list. And I don't know, we were drawn to them because they're defined by their jobs, they're defined by their work. And for some reason we thought it would be cool if they were a couple. Like, what is like a couple who works together? So we just decided that they would be romantically involved. They were very, very, very small characters in the first version we wrote. They kind of like were almost like ensemble. And we ended up expanding their storyline because we just loved them so much. And so they became more major characters. But from the very beginning, we, you know, I think I was like, let's make them in this version. And the thing about Emojiland also is any role can be played by any gender, any ethnicity, any sexual identity. That's really like the goal with this show, because emojis are for everybody. So we never wanted to prescribe. So even though in the original off-Broadway production, they're played by two female identifying actors, it could be played by anybody, but we love the idea of making it a relationship between two women who have these like powerful jobs. You know, they're construction worker and police officer. They protect Emojiland, and we thought we thought it was like, it was nice to show, because we know people like that. I have friends who are like very, very powerful women, and who, you know, some of them just happen to be, you know, in female relationships, but I just hadn't seen that before, really. And so I wanted to give those people that storyline, that voice. So, you know, but in other things that I'm writing now, I think what I'm trying to do is like be as true as I can to, you know, sort of like I mean, just basically the honest journey of someone who is grappling with sexual identity. And there's a character I'm writing right now who's kind of like, who's in this like trying to understand the fluidity and trying to understand where they sort of are on the spectrum. And I draw from my own life. I mean, I've certainly, you know, grappled with those issues, and as have, you know, my new writing partner on this new project is something that definitely he's grappled with. So we're always grabbing from our own lives in all our work. I think the best writing, even if it's not directly from our lives, there's something that comes from within. And so I always try to grab from that.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks for that. We'll come back to talk more about Emojiland as well. This idea of how your characters can be inhabited by actors of different genders, I think, is really fascinating. I was wondering, Tania, whether there are particular characters that you've been involved in creating, or that you've been involved in as a dramaturg or as a director, that you might want to talk about in terms of representation at all.
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about, well, obviously Finn and I are working on a piece called A Mother Song, which has a lead queer character and a couple of women, and I was just thinking about like how much at the beginning of that process, we wanted to make sure that the story was never going to be about queer identity. And I was thinking about that in contrast with a piece that I'm working on that we discussed with you, James, Deptford Wives, in which the story very much is about queer identity, and how actually, whilst working on these two pieces simultaneously, I'm always kind of making the choice to be like, it is a political statement in itself, I feel, still, to choose to have a lead queer character, and I'm constantly trying to toe the line between not making it about that, but also empowering the character's journey. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. It's one of the, I think it's one of the lovely things about, and there's other parts of your work as well. I mean, the reason that I met with you first of all, Tania, was because of It's Only Life, which was I guess was conceived originally, it's like a song cycle, and you made a choice as a director to make sure that that could, not just that it could be read, that some of the relationships in that were queer, but actually that they are read as queer because of how you place people on the stage. And that idea of, yeah, I think there's something really important, that idea of it being political, but it not necessarily being about that, if that makes sense. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to kind of add to that at all.
Well, yeah, because with It's Only Life, it's funny because we talked about that in It's Only Life. It was a John Bucchino song cycle, and there is no definition of who should sing which song. And we had a wonderful ensemble of 5 actors, 3 male identifying and two female identifying actors. And when I was putting together the narratives that I wanted it to read, I had, like, I really made the point of wanting to ignore the genders and actually just like color each one of these 5 people and go like, if person A is with person C, what does that relationship look like? If person C is with person D, what does that relationship look like? And that, I found that really liberating, because I was imposing a dramaturgy onto it that the text was not giving me at all, and that was a purely conceptual choice. And I was really pleasantly surprised by a lot of the audience reaction of being able to see, here's a queer couple, and then the next scene they are in a heterosexual relationship, and then the next scene they are in a queer relationship, and that fluidity, from a personal point of view, just really satisfied me to be able to see that on stage and not have to justify it, apologize for it, make a big deal out of it. It's just, it is what it is.
Thanks, Tania. Yeah, it was I really loved that production, as you know, and it, you know, I think there's something really special about the way that we not just create work, but also that we can reconceptualize work as well. Finn, I was going to ask you both about your work as a musical theatre writer, but I think also your work as a songwriter as well, and the importance of kind of again representing queer characters, and both in kind of larger narrative structures, but also in the smaller structure of songs as well. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I guess sort of the bottom line for me, I think about creating any kind of character is that if they've got, you know, interesting motivations and interesting problems to grapple with, interesting journeys to go on, that is what will make a character feel authentic. And I think that applies no matter, you know, across the kind of whole queer spectrum. I think if that is the defining thing about your character, also it's kind of, you know, what's their wider world, and for me that totally applies within my singer-songwriter work, and that I guess I'm just writing stories from my own point of view and my own experiences of life, and so that's kind of through a particular lens, and I didn't necessarily make a choice to kind of use you know, to specify that I was talking about a male partner or whatever. That's just something that happens naturally in my work as I write, and it's something that a lot of people comment on, but isn't necessarily something that I kind of set out to do. But yeah, and in terms of theatre, in terms of a mother song, I think it's really interesting what Tania said about us kind of setting out to not tell the story about queer identity, because actually I think interestingly for me, what's happened is that it's ended up having to also be a story about queer identity, because, you know, it's a story about traditions and musical traditions and the folk tradition of songs specifically, that's something that also runs through my singer-songwriter work, is that kind of exploration of folk tradition. And that's a really interesting debate when it comes to queerness and LGBT narratives, because they just don't exist in the traditional folk song canon. And so yeah, our lead protagonist Sarah is in a lesbian relationship, but and that relationship is really central to the story. We didn't set out to tell a story that was about her queerness, about her journey as a lesbian woman specifically, but because the whole story is about her grappling with these songs of her past, you know, inevitably that becomes part of the narrative and part of her makeup as a character and her journey. And I guess that's why it's so important that you have, you know, with whatever lens you're telling the story from, that you have people in the room and in the team that have that lived experience, you know, whether we're talking about sexuality or gender or anything, ethnicity, like I think, and race, I think, you know, whatever we're talking about, yeah, those things get ignored and simplified if you don't have the people in the room that have the lived experience.
Thanks, Finn. That's great as well, because that links into one of our questions from Arisha, who asks, how do you approach creating authentic intersectional queer characters? So I'm guessing, you know, and this kind of links into the stuff we've been talking about already, the idea that, you know, we may identify ourselves as queer, but that's not the only part of our identity. And thinking a little bit about, you know, it would be really interesting if you maybe could talk a little bit about how you can, how we can kind of include those intersections in our work as well. I mean, I think partly was what you were just talking about there, Finn, about the people in the room, but it would be lovely to have some examples of how that's worked for you on some of the projects you've been working on. Is there anyone that would like to answer that?
Well, I guess, oh no, you go, Finn.
No, you go, Laura.
I was gonna say that you know, I think I'm working with a bisexual writer right now, writing partner, and we're working on 2 different projects together, and in both projects there just happens to be a bisexual character, because that's his perspective. And you know, and I think it's interesting, because I've run into something a few times now in various projects I'm developing, where I think there's a difficulty in coming from a certain life perspective, whether it be ethnicity or gender, sexual identification, to just create a character that just because you want to kind of tick that box. And I think there's now becoming, especially I've noticed in like Hollywood, you know, there's to give an example, I was developing like a musical animated show, and there were some producers who said, you know what, your main character, the girl, she should be African American. And there was no one on the team who's African American, and it felt, and then so we took the advice, and then we met with someone who said, a big producer at a network who said, who is an African American, and said, you know, if no one on the team is African American, then this is coming across as false, because you're coming from your perspective, whether, you know, wherever you're coming from, that's your viewpoint, and now you're slapping a race on top of that, which does not come from a real place. So I think it's a tricky thing, you know, not to say that like you can't write a queer character if you aren't yourself, you don't identify, but I do think I just think it's tricky. I think we're moving towards a world where people want to hear authentic stories, and I think that it can ring false. So that's my 2 cents. I don't know if that's helpful, but
no, thanks, Laura. I think it is. I think it's one of those things that all of us that write, we have to grapple with. How do we write things that are outside our experience? How does that work? And I think that's really, it's really important for us to kind of think about these questions, not necessarily that we're going to come up with an immediate answer to them, but I definitely think it's worth us thinking about. Finn, did you have something that you wanted to kind of add into that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was just going to sort of talk about character development in general, like, and again, I think it's about paying attention to people and kind of you know, listening to people and observing the world, and kind of just I feel like all the things that apply about being a good writer and writing good characters apply in this conversation, because it's about complexity, it's about contradictions, it's about embracing the complexity and the contradictions in all of us, and in where we come from, and that, you know, as writers we're always trying to get in the skin of our characters, but it becomes then tricky when you don't have the life experience of that character, and that's a really challenging debate, you know, as a writer. I think it's not something I feel equipped to answer either, but you know, about what writers should and shouldn't be writing about, and who writers, which characters writers should and shouldn't be giving a voice to as well. I think it's always a question you should ask yourself in the process.
Tania, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to jump in on something that Finn said of the contradicting, which, like, it just sparked a thought about a conversation that Finn and I have had, but that I've also had on other projects in which we are creating queer characters, and because we are aware that there isn't much representation, and because we are aware that this character is representing the LGBTQ, the fear or the constant battle between, like, writing them as a representation versus writing them as human that isn't going to fully represent, like, the best lesbian there's ever, do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, you know, but if this character says that, then she's gonna, that sounds really bad for the lesbians, and it's like, yeah, but like no character represents everyone, and accepting the humanity of those contradictions, I think is really useful to bear in mind as we write queer characters, and as we feel the pressure as queer creatives to go, but we must represent, but to also to not expect our characters to be able to, as one human, represent the whole experience. That was a thought.
No, that's really interesting. It's one of the things actually as a research group that we come back to more and more, is the fact, because there are so few queer characters, and I think particularly there are so few lesbian, bisexual, trans, non-binary characters in musical theatre, that as soon as one appears, that character is expected to hold the standards for every person that identifies in the same way. And actually, perhaps the answer is just to have more of these characters. But the other thing I wanted to kind of pick up there was the idea of how the workshopping and the actors and their role within the process as well, because I'm thinking particularly about Emoji Land, but thinking about how bad, I've forgotten the actor's name, but the actor that played the police worker, and what she brought to that role, and also thinking about perhaps someone like Josh Lamont and what he brought to the role of Prince, but also thinking about Tania, I know that you do a lot of work with workshopping, and thinking about where there are places where perhaps people have written outside of their own experience and had to in certain ways, whether there are places where the actor is somebody that can be involved to step into that and to help make things more authentic. I don't know whether anyone wants to. I was thinking about Islander as well, Finn, actually, and thinking about the role of the two actors, that particularly in the last production of that. I don't know if anyone wants to. I've just like spurged loads of questions over there. I don't know if anyone wants to to talk to any of those at all.
I was just going to jump in on the workshopping, as it's really interesting because, and that is tying to this whole current debate about should non-queer actors play queer characters, and that debate that feels like it's been ongoing, but now much more so in the spotlight. And the most recent workshop that we did of Deptford Wives, I was quite keen on having as many queer voices in the room, because it is a story about queerness. And having said that, we also wanted to not discriminate on the to not discriminate on the basis of sexuality, and we ended up with a really, I think, helpful balance between having straight people and queer people in the room, and just constantly pushing for queer people's experiences to be heard as we're workshopping it, and it was really invaluable. I can't take away the value that it was having those voices in the room as the actors portraying those characters, to be able to go, this feels false, this feels blah blah blah, even if, you know, it has been created, the content has been created by queer creators, just to go through that kind of sieving process with the actors that are going to speak these words, and kind of check that against what their lived experiences are. I found that very useful, which is not to which I think is a bonus point for the side of queer characters should only be played by queer actors, but that is maybe a whole other debate that we can have at another point.
Also acknowledging that, yeah, I guess that queer means many things as well, and that, you know, me as a gay man, I don't speak for the experience of people across the LGBTQ spectrum, I think also, and yeah, recognizing that would just to add on to what, in terms of what Tania said, having, just because a piece is written by a queer writer doesn't necessarily mean that it won't really benefit from other people coming in that have different lived experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the example of Josh Lehman, who played Prince in Emojiland, and what he brought to the role was so invaluable. And he was one of the first people we cast in when we did the workshop production before it premiered, and there are many lines in the show that just would never have popped off the page without Josh. And he also, you know, there were lines also that he helped tweak, also because he was like, no, I think I'd say it like this. And so, you know, and that often happens in the workshopping of a piece. And there's, you know, Josh is an incredibly talented comedian artist who happens to be queer, but you know, and just was a perfect fit for the role. And honestly, not even what we had pictured for the role. We had pictured someone very, very different. And then we started working with a director who suggested him, and he made it leap off the page.
I think that's really lovely. And I kind of wanted to just mention, is it Felicia Boswell as well? I think was the actor whose name I was trying to remember earlier as well. And just you know, there's all sorts of things that people, you know, whether they're coming from queer background, straight background, you know, from their lived experience of race, of gender, all of those different things. And it really struck me with Emojiland how important it must have been to have some of, you know, I could have mentioned a whole range of the actors that were involved in that, and just how important it was because I think Emojiland, because you're so open about what gender could play this and what sort of person could play that, it gives a lot more agency to the actors, which must be, I guess, quite scary from a writer's point of view as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting because, you know, when we created the framework of the show, there's so many places that it can go. And, you know, we honestly, the George Aboud, who ended up playing Nerdface, he's Lebanese, and, you know, his sort of immigrant experience brought a whole new thing to Nerdface, who's a new emoji who comes in the update before they build the firewall, and none of the emojis are allowed in. So, you know, him being a new emoji and being like scapegoated for something like that brought a whole other thing that we never even intended. We didn't intend to cast Nerdface as an immigrant, but it's just the way it happened. And it elevated the work because of it. And with Felicia, we honestly always loved the idea of a person of color playing police officer because of someone grappling with, you know, and the police, you know, what we're dealing with today with you know, all these issues with the police, and how does it feel for someone who is normally marginalized, like, to be in that position and have to follow out those orders that they might not believe in, but it's their duty and it's their job. And so we thought that was like a really interesting thing for the character of police officer to have to grapple with. And Felicia Felicia was amazing and brought it to life in a beautiful way.
Thank you so much. I think we've been sort of skirting around a question that Matthew Bugg asked, which is, to what extent does a performer's sexuality or queerness affect or interrelate with a character's sexuality, and at what sort of stage as creators do you begin thinking about that? I think we've sort of answered that question in the last few things that people have been talking about, but if there's anything else that people want to mention on that at all, then do feel free to do that. I'm just having a look to see what else. One thing that might be interesting to talk about would be Vicky's question here about how you balance comedy with more heavy-hitting subjects without it being jarring in terms of tone. I think that's a really interesting question for writers. So is there anyone that would be able to kind of talk about the use of comedy in writing, and particularly when it's being used in a perhaps more musical which is also dealing with some quite serious subjects?
Yeah, I mean, there's comedy to be found in very dark places, I guess. For me, the two coexist just so naturally, in various ways. Whether that's in a very people are funny and they're also tragic, so I guess I don't necessarily thinking if I can speak to specific experiences, but I think the most interesting moments for me for comedy are often where they come out of those very dark moments, and where those two things really intertwine, rather than having to think of here's the funny moment and here's the dark moment, but just sort of embracing that everything is a little bit tragic and a little bit funny all at the same time, I suppose. Don't know if that's helpful at all and answers your question.
I think something I like to always remember is that intense specificity is broad relatability. So the more specific, the funnier it is. That's always what I have found. And and I also think, I mean, for me, I think, a lot of comedy can come, purely from source material. And, and I'm working on some projects right now where the characters are these animals, these crazy creatures, and I'm looking at I'm reading all about these animals and their natures and how they are monogamous creatures that mate for life. And so how can I play off that, and how can I have one of those creatures who doesn't want that at all? That's the opposite of what they want, because they don't think that they belong there. They feel different. And so I think there's inherent comedy there just because of the source material. And so that's sort of where I come from.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I feel like this links into a little bit to something we were talking about. I was talking about, I think I've spoken particularly with Tania about this before, but perhaps with Finn as well, about the idea of the kind of queer tragedy story that gets told quite often, or queerness as being struggle, that kind of thing. And there is a question here that's come in, which is about how do you go about creating characters that challenge queer stereotypes and tropes, and to create a more authentic, raw and real character. And I think we're starting to talk about that a little bit, because I mean, having spoken, I've had probably spoken for about an hour with each of you on an interview, and I know that you're all really funny people. And I think that those of us that are part of the queer community, I think that humor is a really important part of who we are. But I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about how to create characters that kind of go against maybe stereotypes or tropes, or that go against that kind of being queer is a tragedy type idea. I don't know whether Tania, that's something you might want to talk to.
Yeah, because we did speak quite a lot about this when we had our chat, James. And I remember us speaking that when I was training as an actor, and kind of, first of all, not really seeing any space for queer characters within the musical theatre scene, and for the very few that existed to be deeply tragic. So you didn't really wear that identity, I guess, because it was just keep it to the side. And because all that these characters can be is tragic, was kind of the perception that I had 10 years ago in the musicals, in the musical theatre scene then, and I feel like we have come such a long way, but it's still, I don't know. I feel like Finn and I talk a lot about this, and because we are bored, because I feel like everyone that is queer and that likes musicals is bored of that story, of the story of struggle, of the story of struggle to come out, of the story of deep sadness, and that we want to be telling. It just feels like the most important thing is to be telling stories that have any other lens to it that isn't the Greek tragedy to our existence. And the thing is, like, with Deptford Wives that we were talking about, James, which is a love story, and I'm a huge fan of rom-coms, and all I want to do with that show is just to be able to have a beautiful lesbian rom-com that in where nobody dies. Like, nobody will die, it will be fine. I promise you, they will just kiss and they will sing songs. I think that's what I would like to see. Does that answer your question?
I think that's rather lovely. Thank you so much for that, Tania. That's great. I'm going to keep going through the questions, but do feel free to, obviously panelists, feel free to chip into any of them or all of them as you wish. Frank Videjo, sorry, I'm saying that name wrong. Frank Videjo asks for any great resources for songwriters. I guess what sort of things can be helped? I mean, this is a very general question, but what sort of things help you to write songs?
What sort of things help to write songs? Well, just writing lots and lots and lots of songs, I guess, is sort of the answer. But and finishing songs, finishing ideas. I think a lot of people get caught up in the early stages of writing a song. I don't have the question. I'm no idea where you're at in your songwriting journey, but that's definitely a thing. Trying to see things through to completion. I think you learn so much about your songwriting that way. And listening to lots of songs and analyzing them and pulling them apart. But I think we've got a real opportunity in musical theatre in terms of giving ourselves a brief for the song that we're writing. And for me, that, yes, I'm a singer-songwriter, but my work in musical theatre has helped me develop my songwriting craft so much, because I go, okay, this song needs to go on this journey, it needs to take my character from here to here. And not every musical applies to this, but having a clear journey, a clear tone, a clear point in the story, like even if you don't work in theatre, kind of setting yourself a task for a song, I think can be a really sort of, in a way, low pressure way to develop your songwriting, because you're not going, I feel all of these things and I need to put them into a song. But this song is sort of outside of yourself a bit, which is a helpful thing for me, I guess. And rhyming dictionaries, they help.
Rhyming dictionaries are definitely a thing that I use a lot when I'm songwriting. And do you want to jump in there, Laura?
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, yeah, definitely. I use Rhyme Zone, which is an app, which is great. But yes, I think, well, for me, when I'm writing songs, even if I'm just honestly just writing a pop song, I always come from character perspective. So I sometimes like put myself in that, whatever that moment is, and I just journal and I just see what comes out. And sometimes, it's just gobbledygook, but maybe there's something in there that's like the seed of a song. And for me, sometimes it starts with a title, like a hook. Sometimes that's where it all stems from. And then other times it's a one lyric that comes to me. But yeah, I think I always come from character. I always come from story and what I'm trying to say in that moment from that character's perspective.
And yeah, totally. And in terms of shaking things up, I guess other things, sometimes I'll write while I'm walking. I won't write at the piano, or I'll start with a rhythm, like lay down a drum beat right on top of that. Finding different ways in as starting points that might help to open up things if you're stuck, I guess.
I think that's all really great advice. Thank you so much for that. I've got another question here, which is from Nathan Shanley. who says, as a queer musical theatre writer, how do you get your foot into the door or find spaces to workshop, perform your work, as it often feels like it's impossible to get the work from page to stage? And just a bit of context there, Nathan's been working on a musical with us at the University of Wolverhampton as part of his master's course. So he's got a finished script. He's done a few workshop performances, read-throughs, and I suppose he's asking what the next stage is. What do you do next?
I guess the really blunt answer is find a producer. And I hate that it's that, not necessarily, but I feel like if I was putting myself in those shoes, that would be my, either that or self-produce, both of which I've done. And I know that feels particularly unhelpful if you're finding that you're contacting people and you're not necessarily hearing back. What else would I advise, Finn? What would you advise? What are your thoughts?
It's funny, I find myself increasingly giving advice that was given to me like 5 or 10 years ago that I really hated and thought was really unhelpful advice. And now I'm going, I want to give this advice, which I guess is, yeah, if you can, and I find this advice problematic because I think some people can do this and some people can't, and it also implies a financial means, but get your work on, you know, like try and get stuff on that people can see, whatever that means. Whether if you're in university, great, that's a great opportunity to try and get stuff on. Because I think a lot of people, I've sometimes come across people that carry this sort of one show around for years and years and years and years. Whereas that and carrying one show around for years and years and years might be the thing, but also it doesn't make you better as a writer. And I think to get maybe write something smaller, which is again advice I hate to give, but like write something that you can get on, or that you can try and get in front of people workshops so that you can learn from that and write something else as well, is something I would say, rather than carrying one show around for sort of 5 years, which also is a thing we're all doing. But yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, well, and I was just going to say that it feels like if I track the journeys, like my journey and the journeys of people that I know that have, like, what was their first musical if they didn't get like a NAHAT producer that picked it off the ground? And the answer is usually a self-producing job in whatever capacity that is, whether that it's, you know, a smaller run, whether that's in the scratch performance, but in whatever capacity is possible within your contacts and your learning. I did that and bought the I think I want to produce book and learn how to put together a budget. But just I think that advice, Finn, of get your work on feels like the most actionable of what we've been talking.
I also think I totally agree, and I, you know, also Emojiland was self-produced at first, and that's how we gained traction for sure. But I also think there's this new space for podcasts, and I think there's a really interesting new opportunity for new musicals to debut in that medium. And I do know a lot of podcast companies and producers who are looking for musical podcasts. So I think that's, if you have something that could lend itself to that medium, that could be an interesting route to go, because it's obviously a lot cheaper to just record everything instead of putting it up on the stage first, and then get people to fall in love with it, and then they want to see it on stage. Totally.
I think that's great advice, and also applies to the cast recording thing too. You know, if you can record a few songs, you'll also get a sense whether people vibe with it, and if there is interest, and you manage to build an audience for it, then producers are more likely to have conversations with you too.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's all really useful advice. We've got 3 questions left, and I think we've got about 10 minutes, so I think we can probably cover these ones. So this is another anonymous question. When writing characters, do you ever decide on the sexuality of them first, so you know going into it that they'll be a queer character, or is it something that is part of the process, discovery or workshopping process? And I'm guessing the answer to this is probably that both of those things can happen, but it would be interesting to see some of your experiences in those areas.
I feel like I've never workshopped or worked on a script in which the sexual orientation of your character wasn't wasn't defined in like the very beginning of the writing stages, as just as you draw your character bio and you start getting to know who they are. I've never been part of a process in which it has come as an not an afterthought, but that has come later into the workshopping.
There was one piece, Plots, which we worked on together, which that happened. But yes,
It did. Yes, it did. You're
yeah,
right.
it did. Yeah, for me, it's both. But I guess, yeah, you know, if a fundamental part of your character changes, then often so do their motivations and their circumstances and the way that they interact on the stage. So I'd say it's an important thing to get off the ground early. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, one of the other things that I'll just throw this in there, just from having interviewed a number of actors, is that quite often, this is one of my, I think I may have mentioned this on another panel, but one of my favorite interviews with an actor who just said, if it's not shown elsewhere in the text of a musical when I'm playing a character, I assume that they are gay. And so from doing that, and that can go for any musical where a character doesn't have romantic attachments. I think anywhere from that really changes the way, and you can then play around with things, and it might not be explicit in the script. The other thing that we mentioned last week when we had a panel on bisexuality is that there is no character in the whole of musical theatre that cannot be played as bisexual, because we never see a character every single moment of their life, and we never see every single moment of their thoughts. And I think there are definitely ways that we can that you can workshop and that you can play with some of these ideas, depending on who your actors are and depending on who your director is and how open you are. And in some ways that's what happened with It's Only Life as well. I think opening up musicals in that way is a really interesting thing to do. I'm just going to go on to the next. Oh, so go on. Did you want to say something there, Laura?
Oh, I was just going to say that something really fun and happened after we premiered Emojiland. There was a fan who started drawing all this art on Instagram of all, I don't know if you've seen this, but of all the different characters in different queer scenarios. So, and like hooking up and like, what would it be like if, if Smize and Skull got together, and if Skull and Prince got together, and like, it was really, I mean, they're beautiful drawings too, but I just loved that too, that I was like, yeah, those are all, and when we do the TV version of it, we'll have all those plots.
And I mean, it's one of the things I love about Emojiland, because the genders are fluid, those could totally happen in future productions. And I think one of the things that those people who are directors and producers where you can, when you've got the licensing thing to do, be brave, try these things out. Don't just leave these to fan art. These things can happen in productions, depending on the way you direct it, depending on how open you are with your actors. So I think there's something definitely that we can learn from that. I was going to ask, there's a question here, it's a general question from Mecca, who says, what in your opinion is a key characteristic of a person wishing to be an ally to the LGBTQ community? And Mecca also says, thank you for an amazing conversation. Does anyone have an answer for that at all?
I guess I'd say listening is a key characteristic of anyone wanting to be an ally in any circumstance. Yeah.
And educating yourself, I guess. Listen, and like seeking that education. I mean, like as an active thing. Yeah.
I think also giving us space, and I think also promoting even things like this. The recording of this will come out next week. If you can stick it on Twitter, it means that other people will see this discussion and other people will get involved in this discussion. And whether they are queer people and it really helps to see themselves represented, or whether they are people who are allies, who are kind of exploring some of these ideas for the first time. I think the more that you can amplify the voices from people in the community, and this goes across all sorts of different parts of representation, the more that we amplify each other's voices, the voices that are not heard as much, I think the better. So I hope that helps. Thank you for that question, Mecca. We've got one more question which we're going to finish with. This is from somebody called Claire Chandler. Sorry about that. I don't know how I managed to spoonerize you there. Claire's one of my colleagues from the University of Wolverhampton. And Claire asks, with A Strange Loop winning the Pulitzer Prize, how do you think this might change things for queer writers? Any thoughts on that?
Good question.
A great question.
Sorry, Laura. Go.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, I haven't seen it, but I've listened to it, and yeah, I think it's fantastic, and it's opening up a whole new world of possibilities. And I mean, that's a great work, and it deserves every bit of praise that it's gotten. And yeah, so I mean, I think it's like, it's inspiring. Go out there. If you have a story to tell, that's the thing I think that I would take from that, is that there's no story that shouldn't be told. So if you have something to say it.
Thanks, Laura.
I would also say that I feel like A Strange Loop, even if it feels like, when I think about it, The Strange Loop in the context of the UK musical theatre scene, I think that it's maybe a few years away from it there being a space for something like A Strange Loop to be on that level, on that level of visibility. I mean, and I'm excited for us to get there, but it's interesting of thinking about A Strange Loop and going, Finn and I saw it together, and how moved we both were by it, and by a new perspective in musical theatre, like a voice unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and going, okay, this is coming, this new wave is coming. I don't feel like we're quite on the same cusp in the UK, but I feel like we're getting there, is my opinion.
Yeah, I loved A Strange Loop. I guess just a tiny little thing to add to that is that I think, as well as we've talked about characters and we've talked about narrative, but we haven't talked much about form. And I think you also, yeah, kind of go against the characters you've seen, but also I think feel free to deconstruct the form of musical theatre in that process. And I think A Strange Loop does that really well. It understands musical theatre so well that it can kind of pull that apart in many ways. And I think that's also part of the queer experience of being a writer as well, is being given this world and then morphing it into a way that works for you and your experience. And I think bring that into the writing. I think that's a thing that A Strange Loop might open up for queer writers.
I think it's a really exciting time for queer writers at the moment. One of the things I would always say to people is that there are venues, there are organisations, there are theatre companies, there are universities that are there to support the work of queer writers. And it is on a much smaller scale in the UK than it is in the US sometimes, but those places are there, and we are here to support each other with those things. I mean, these last 3 weeks, these last 3 panels that I've been involved with, have been just so lovely. And every week I feel like this thing almost in my heart, which is, oh my goodness, we're having these conversations that I've been wanting us to have for so many years. And so I thank you so much to all of our panelists today, to Tania, Finn and Laura, for all of the wisdom. Thank you also to the people that have been contributing into the chat. I know I haven't got round to reading out all of those things, but there's some really useful advice from some of the attendees here as well, which have been wonderful. I said this is our last panel. It isn't quite, because on the 1st of March, actually, I'm just looking, I think the date is wrong on this, but it will be on the 1st of March. We're going to be doing a kind of concert lecture called The Louder We Get. It's going to be it's a concert lecture for LGBT History Month. And as part of that, there's going to be loads of performances from our students at the University of Wolverhampton. But we've also got a couple of panels with students where some of our students are talking about their experiences of sexuality, and some are talking about their experiences of gender. And I would love to invite people to come and have a look at that, to see some of the work that we do at the university, but also to hear from from students who perhaps are in a slightly different position to those of us that have been working in the industry as well. I'm just popping a link here, but I am very aware that the date on this is wrong, but hopefully the date on this will change imminently. but please feel free to join us for that. Thank you again to our panel today, to Tania, Finn and Laura. Thank you to Elena and the events team and the University of Wolverhampton for supporting us. And I hope that you all have a really lovely weekend. I will put up links for this panel and the other 2 panels that we've had so far on my Twitter profile, which is Dr. James Lovelock. And thank you all very much for coming. And I hope to see and speak to you all very soon. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.